And now we turn to panel 2. Here we will be discussing decision-making under pressure, governing in real time amid crisis and complexity. And we have an excellent panel here as well that's going to take this topic on for us. We have Misha, Lobban, Clarke, Leslie-Ann, Seon, Vashti, Guyadeen, and our moderator, who will introduce our panelists more, is Louis Kinley. Louis is the co-founder and CEO. So Louis, if you can put your video on so Quantrell bring you up as I introduced you. Excellent. So Louis is the co-founder and CEO of LinkMe, a data governance and automation company that helps finance leaders take control of the data flowing through their organizations and use AI safely on top of it. He's a self-taught software engineer whose first website went online in 1997. Louis started his career building data infrastructure for Fortune 500 companies like Microsoft and Citi before joining a startup, going remote, and moving to Trinidad. Of course, he's back in his home country of the USA right now, but he continues to have very close ties with us in the region, and especially here with us at CCGI. He has served several times as moderator for us for Governance Week, and we are very pleased to have him moderate this panel of all females, Louis. So you have quite a tough job in front of you, but I'm sure it's a job you look forward to. So I'm very happy to hand over this panel to you as you briefly introduce our panelists. Just to remind everyone, if you did not receive the agenda earlier, just let us know and we'll put it in the chat so you get the full profiles for all of our panelists. And now, Louis, I'm just going to hand over to you to take control of this panel.
Wow, thank you so much, Kamla and CCGI for the trust and the opportunity. Really excited to share the stage with you all. Obviously, a lot of great panels today and a lot of great speakers. So we're going to cut straight to it. One of our panelists has to leave a little bit early, so we've got 3 amazing speakers that Kamla just introduced, and I'm going to cut straight to Vashti to do her opening presentation because I know we've got to get her out of here a little bit early to deal with some of the things unfolding after what's going on in Venezuela. So instead of the traditional lengthy introductions here, I'll just get right into the meat of it. And Vashti, if you'd like to get on stage as well and share what you've prepared for us.
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you all for accommodating me. It's an unfortunate situation that I have to deal with following this meeting. So, when we speak about volatility today, we are no longer referring to isolated crises. If you operate in the private sector of Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, you would know that volatility has become the operating environment. It has become the normal, especially over the last 3 to 4 years. And in fact, since the pandemic, I would say, businesses more so are navigating geopolitical uncertainties, supply chain disruptions, cyber threats, rapid technological change, climate risk, changing trade rules. And we have seen, later on I will talk about in terms of the changing trade rules, the WTO, in terms of a WTO, that's the World Trade Organization perspective, and we saw that more so in terms of a moratorium that has been in place since 1998, which impacts on e-commerce, and increasingly public expectations around transparency and accountability. In that environment, governance is no longer simply about compliance. It has become a strategic advantage. So let's look at what challenges affect the industry, the private sector today within the Caribbean. And bear in mind that more than 90% of firms operating in the Caribbean fall under the definition of micro and small businesses. So there are 4 areas. I have categorized it into 4 challenges that firms in our region are facing. And one is keeping pace with change. Secondly, trust has become a business asset. And thirdly, technology is changing governance itself. And we have seen that through artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, data protection, and finally, global uncertainty has impacted the way that we do business in the region. So, Louis, those are my opening comments.
Right, thank you, Vashti. And so as we wait for Louis to put on his camera, I want to say for everyone to know Vashti recently got her doctorate. So she is now, in fact, Dr. Vashti Guyadeen, and she's the CEO of the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce. Vashti, we join everyone in congratulating you on this wonderful achievement. And also thanking you for your
Thank you very
comment
much.
and being present today, despite your hectic schedule. So Louis, sorry about that. Go ahead.
No, I absolutely appreciate it, Kamla, and congratulations, Dr. Guyadeen. And next up, we'd like to introduce Misha Lobban Clarke, who, of course, has been helping organizations across the region for a couple decades, has been in leadership positions, most recently executive director, Barbados Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And we'd like to invite her up to share another private sector perspective on how things are changing these days.
Thank you, Louis. And let me first thank Kamla and the CCGI team for inviting me. And, let me just greet also my fellow panelists this afternoon. Now, I look at the theme for Governance Week as well as the topic for our panel session today, and I see them as interconnected because they raise for me one fundamental question: how does board and management make sound decisions when certainty no longer exists? And so I believe the answer lies in understanding the board and management decision-making dynamic. That is the relationship that enables both to lead together and to make timely and sound decisions in an increasingly complex and uncertain world. And that board management decision-making dynamic will really be the focus of my opening comments. I think Vashti did a very good job, and the panel discussion earlier, painting for us the kind of environment in which we operate. So I'll just go straight in to say this when I'm looking at this dynamic, that we often think about board governance as providing the strategic direction, oversight, and certainly ensuring accountability. And then we think of management as execution and operations. And I'll say that these distinctions may appear straightforward in stable times, but today, in an era of disruption and crisis, the quality of the relationship between both board and management determines whether an organization is able to respond with clarity and agility versus uncertainty and paralysis. So today, what I've chosen to do is just look at 3 short points on what governing in real time during a crisis has taught me about the dynamic between board and management. So my first point relates to the clarity of roles that enables better decision making. One of the greatest misconceptions during a crisis is that boards need to get more operational. And the truth is, in my experience, the opposite is true. A crisis really should reinforce and not diminish the distinct roles of board governance and management. And I think when the roles remain clear, organizations can adapt quickly and function effectively. And I'll cite during the COVID pandemic, when information was incomplete and the circumstances were changing daily, boards and management leaders had to make consequential decisions without the benefit of certainty and complete information. And that experience highlighted for me the lesson that board and management must work together. It is foundational to enabling organizations to function with agility and confidence under pressure. So it reinforced for me an important lesson that good governance does not create paralysis. In fact, it should create the the oversight and the strategic direction that will enable effective decision-making and certainly empower management to act timely and confidently, especially during the changing conditions in which we now operate. The second point I want to speak to is trust is the bridge between board and management. I'll say that no governance framework can compensate for the absence of trust. And during periods of uncertainty, boards must be responsive, but they must also trust management to operate within agreed parameters. And certainly management must trust boards to provide the kind of oversight that it needs without undermining timely execution and function at the operational level. My thought is that trust is not built during a crisis. It's a crisis simply reveals whether or not trust already exists. An observation that I had during the COVID pandemic was that organizations with clear decision-making authority, healthy board management relationships, transparent communication, and whose boards had invested in stronger stakeholder relationships, those were the entities that were able to better position themselves and navigate effectively the impact of the COVID pandemic on their operations. So I'll just say trust is therefore not simply a leadership value, it is a governance asset, and Vashti said that earlier, and I'm underscoring that point. Now, the third and final point for me is that resilience is a key outcome of good governance. For many years, governance discussions have centered primarily around compliance, and while compliance is essential, I think today's volatile environment requires something more. It requires boards to strengthen the capacity of organizations to be more resilient. And so for me, when I thought about this topic, I thought about the fact that, an important question that boards really should be asking themselves today is, are we building organizations capable of making sound decisions when disruption inevitably occurs? Because that is the norm for us. So I think what it requires is that we must have adaptive governance, we must have agile management, informed oversight, and strong stakeholder relationships, and certainly continuous learning. Because in my view, increasingly boards will not be judged solely by how well they manage risk. They will be judged by how well they enable organizations to adapt in today's volatile environment. So in closing, I just wanted to say that I've come to believe from my own lived experience that the relationship that exists between board and management is one of an organization's greatest strategic asset. Because board governance and management are not competing functions. They are in fact complementary responsibilities. And together, when they are complementary, they will ensure that an organization can make sound decisions and function effectively and navigate times of crisis and uncertainty. Because ultimately, the effectiveness of governance in a volatile world is determined not by how well boards and management function or perform it independently, but how they effectively arrive at sound decisions and lead together in the face of uncertainty. So thank you, and I just turn back over to you, Lois.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you for the three easy takeaways there, but obviously not easy to actually implement and put into practice. And up next, Miss Leslie Ann Seon is the founder, as many of you would know, of a Seon and Associates law firm, and also a director of Republic Bank, and would like to invite her up on stage to provide another perspective here before we get into the panel.
Thank you very much, Louis. Thank you to the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute for the invitation. And I think it couldn't be more timely to have a topic like this and to have Corporate Governance Week while we have all of these geopolitical activities and macroeconomic volatility ongoing at the same time. I wanted to bring a broader insight into the topic today based on my cross-sector experience, particularly encompassing private sector companies, non-profit entities, family businesses, educational institutions, regional and development bodies, statutory corporations, and of course, financial institutions. So for me, for very cogent reasons, I didn't want to limit my perspective to any one particular sector-specific theme, but to bring my insight to bear, not just having been a member of a board or chairman of a board, but also acting as corporate legal advisor to these entities that I've identified. And I looked at the topic, decision-making under pressure, governing in real time amid crisis and complexity. And I underscored a few of the words: decision-making, pressure, governing, crisis, and complexity. And I think that the challenges that face the diverse group of entities that I have described, where governance is concerned, you can tell that pressure comes in different forms. And how we respond and execute these decisions under pressure is what I believe shows the same level of governance engagement throughout these entities. And the pressure that we speak about can range from moderate to extreme. It can be connected to the political environment, sovereignty questions, shareholder expectations, succession disputes, geopolitical hostilities, new regulations, or the pandemic. And so what are these challenges? These challenges can be falling revenue, cash flow constraints, weak documentation, excessive debt, cyber vulnerability, reputational risk, poor cash flows, political interference, and fraud. And so we ask, how do these challenges negatively impact the company, its employees, and its stakeholders? So we have cost-cutting cycles, we have redundancies, we have loss of consumer confidence, we have increased regulatory scrutiny, productivity decline, degraded customer service, data compromise and breaches, litigation exposure, brand damage, ambiguity in accountability and processes, and God forbid, insolvency. So when the question is asked, how are these challenges to be addressed in a crisis? The first thing I would say is that the board should not be deciding under pressure. It should be executing under pressure. And this brings an entirely different cognitive and governance posture. It is said that boards that govern well in a crisis didn't find their footing under pressure. They built it long before the pressure arrived. And that's what I refer to as the decision architecture, what we are creating, what we are building based on an open and accountable framework, risk anticipation, crisis management protocols, identification of our SWAT team for execution. The best crisis decisions are made before the crisis. And why is that? It's because of governance preparedness, strategic vigilance, a governance framework that is dynamic, not fixed, and rigidly demarcated between operations and oversight. And I'm sure Misha and I will have a good discourse on that. A board sliding scale from engaged to operational and back to engaged. For me, a board must at all times, even when it's superbly good, remain technically informed and operationally alert while respecting the execution role for management. Now, I'm not advocating the abandonment of the oversight role, but rather that even before moments of crisis and complexity, directors must move from passive to enhanced oversight. Governance has to be dynamic. I like to call it becoming operationally literate, so that we cannot hide behind the oversight role where circumstances demand deeper inquiry, technical understanding, and active challenges. I deem it a risk management tool to indulge in a dose of healthy paranoia, not driven by fear and anxiety or mistrust, but evidence-based and data-driven. As a board, we must be fully engaged all of the time, challenging assumptions, exploring worst-case scenarios, demanding detailed risk papers, requesting contingency plans. This is enhanced oversight. Still oversight, but at an enhanced level. Asking the hard questions regularly, exercising independent judgment, demonstrating an unwillingness to be compromised ethically, shifting your role as director from attendance to governance. This is the decision architecture. This is the accountability structure that we want to enable the board of directors and the individual directors to navigate the complexity and volatility of the crisis that it faces at any point in time. So therefore, governance preparedness is the key. Ongoing awareness, scrutiny, and assessment, willingness to dissent, to escalate if necessary. That should be a director's habit. So for me, if we are captivated by the appointments, by the titles, the prestige, the remuneration, you can't do the preparation work properly. And without that, every complexity becomes a crisis. And you begin to operate out of panic as opposed to urgency. And decisions made under pressure are inherently vulnerable, risky, and hazardous to business and operations. We spend a lot of time on an academic and theoretical discourse on board composition skills, matrices, independence criteria, but not enough time on whether the people who meet the criteria do their work between the meetings so that a board is emboldened when decisions must be made in times of crisis and complexity. That, for me, is the preparedness-based governance that can withstand the decision-making or the decision execution under pressure amidst crises, complexities, and real-time problems.
Wow. Thank you for that. I think that was a critical shift that you mentioned there from moving, to really executing under pressure instead of deciding under pressure, and really ensuring that you've thought of everything beforehand and got that clear decision architecture. So to get into the panel here, and I'd like to, if we could get everyone up on screen, and there's obviously no shortage of examples of this in the world, but if you could each just describe one moment where you or the organization you were leading had to make a significant governance decision with incomplete information. And what did that actually feel like in that moment, and how did you get through that?
Sure. So, Lois, I would go first. I would have to preface this by saying for the past 6 years, we have been making decisions with incomplete information. And this is most of my career, all of my career, I have been a researcher. And from a business support organization perspective, our core areas is advocacy. And we depend on surveys in order to get information from members across the board, because the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce, we represent all economic sectors. So when I talk about incomplete data, it's not just members' inability to complete the surveys that we requested, but members are not able to understand what geopolitical or economic issue they are currently facing and how it's going to impact their particular sector. And this was stemming from the COVID-19 and I'll give a vivid example. Drawing back again the issue of the e-commerce moratorium that was in place since 1998. So this came up, it expired, it was set to expire March of this year. Most of the SMEs that operate within the services sector were not aware that such a moratorium existed. So to be faced with and asking for their feedback on how is this going to impact your business, it took some education. We had to launch an education campaign to say, you know what, this is going to impact whichever subsector, the animation industry, how it's going to impact your sector. And it's called for a deep understanding, a deep dive into what really, how is that going to impact you, when they had absolutely no idea? Because they all, especially with services, they trade without crossing a border. So how do you make a decision at a management level and a board level? It meant that how we disseminate the survey instrument took a different spin altogether. The design of that instrument had to be different from what we did in the past. It meant more focus group to gather information. And there has been a silver lining, because in the past, in collecting data has been a challenge, especially if you're operating within the Caribbean. But more so, given that businesses know what's in it for them when they give this data, they are more able to provide us as BSOs with information. And that has been the silver lining.
So, if you don't mind, I'll go next. I'll share my experience again from COVID. You know, that's the lived experience. But certainly, as Vashti mentioned, it can obtain even currently. But as the executive director for the chamber at that time, so you know, COVID happened. Nobody had a playbook, and I found myself implementing a decision of the governing council. So I just wanted to put that in for Leslie Ann. The council made a decision, but it was leadership who was responsible for executing, and I continue to maintain that boards don't execute. I found myself implementing that decision that was made, that we must close a segment of the organization's operations that depended heavily on tourism arrivals. So it was a necessary decision made in an environment of unprecedented uncertainty, and certainly where information was incomplete, and we definitely had conditions changing on a daily basis. And what made it particularly a difficult decision for leadership to be implementing was that it wasn't simply about closing a facility. It was about balancing the organization's financial sustainability in this climate with the responsibility that we had to employees. And so I certainly had the responsibility to protect the long-term viability of the organization, but then I had to do what is necessary in terms of communicating openly and compassionately with the employees whose livelihood were being affected. It meant being a compassionate leader, listening to their concerns, working to support them through counseling, and putting in place that kind of structure that would help to transition them to other opportunities once they became available. And so I also had to lead consultations and engagement with businesses and government entities who would have been also impacted by the closure of this operation. And you know what I remembered wasn't really the fact that, okay, I had to be operating without information or just the uncertainty within which I was operating, but really the weight of knowing that every decision affected people's lives and their future. And that experience reinforced three things for me that I wanted to just leave. First, adaptability is certainly essential during circumstances where change happens rapidly. But timely and transparent communication is really what builds trust, even when we don't have all the answers, because we certainly didn't have. Certainly didn't have all the answers. And thirdly, that stakeholder engagement is not something that we do after making decision. It is very integral to decision making, and it is one of those structures and systems that is critical and should exist prior to any crisis. Those are my few points.
Yeah, those incredible. Go ahead, Leslie.
Hi, Louis. Yes. Well, that question sort of took me back to my very young days as a director. I probably had maybe a year or two of experience on a board. and my chairman at the time was presenting a proposal in which a financier for a project was being selected. And I thought that the process was not open and fair, even though there was nothing wrong on paper with the financier that he was proposing the board to approve. But I felt that we should have had the benefit of proposals from other financiers so that we can see if there were better terms and conditions that could be offered there. And so I advocated my position, and it seemed at the time that the board went along with the concerns expressed and decided, yes, let's see if we can get some more information from other financiers. I don't think the chairman was too pleased with perhaps what he might have described as this young punk. And he called a special meeting sometime thereafter. And lo and behold, brought in the minister with responsibility for the particular corporation. So I knew immediately it was to put pressure on the board and probably myself. And so the tension in the room was quite thick. And I guess everyone was looking to see whether I would maintain my position or not. But, you know, there are moments like this where you have to show courage. And I knew what I was asking for was the right thing. And I didn't feel I needed to compromise that position. So I told the minister exactly what I had said to the board before and to the chairman. And I said, I am accountable to you as well, minister. And you would also hold me liable if the board did not make a proper, well-reasoned decision. And so this was the reason for my asking for more financiers to present their proposals. So in the end, we did get proposals from other financiers. The one that the chairman preferred was selected, but on proper terms and conditions. But it just says to me that sometimes you have to be uncomfortable or make others uncomfortable and not worry about what the appointer thinks or can do to you or about preserving your position as director on the board, but following the commands of doing what you know to be right in the best interest of the entity or the company.
Yeah, that courage under pressure, I guess that's why you've been doing this a while and people keep inviting you back, right? and keep inviting you onto more boards, and that
I know they might be rethinking it every now and again, Louis. I'm getting up there now in vintage, so I'm scaling down.
Well, I don't know, that perspective though, and that longevity, I think it's easy for those coming up to have a recency bias that really lacks the benefit of that experience and lived experience through different crises, right? So,
well, that's why I enjoy being a participant in a forum like this, because I think it's for people like Vashti and Misha and myself to share our knowledge and experience in direct, real, practical, pragmatic terms, not just the theory, not just the generics.
Yeah, absolutely. Which I think leads us well into the next question, which is when a crisis hits, how do you actually get that timely and reliable information from all the stakeholders? Not just the polished decks that they send you, but how do you really know what you can trust, what you're seeing, and that jives with reality?
Sure. So if I could go first, because I
Yeah.
have to leave shortly. I know I started off saying for the first question posed to me was that I have had to make decisions for the past 6 years with incomplete data. But on the flip side, there is so much data available, meaning that the in things now is dashboards, data analytics, and most of those that information that is available via AI, ChatGPT, is from advanced economies. So for chambers of commerce, it means that how we have to look at the reliability of that data. And secondly, do it apply to us? So it means before at a management executive level, it means looking at that data, applying checks and balances to determine whether that information is valid and pertinent to our sector. to the Caribbean because most, as I stated before, most Caribbean firms are SMEs, are micro and small businesses, in fact. So it's applying that reliability test, going back to our basic research one-on-one. And in most instances, that data that is made available is not applicable to our sector because we are all SMEs. And so it means applying reference checks and balances before you take that information to your board.
Yeah, you would hope they're doing that, right? But Leslie, let's circle it back around and change up the order a bit. How do you validate that? What gave you that hunch, in year one that something was should have checked in more, and how have you built on that over the years?
Well, I think over time, experience really is the best judgment, and there are certain triggers or red flag issues that you can identify quite quickly. I know Misha talked about trust in management and confidence, and that's acquired over time. It has to be tested, it has to be proven.
Yeah.
I tend to try not to be overly dependent on just pure management summaries and reports without scrutinizing or without asking questions to get more information to enable my understanding, because I'm not coming to the board as a know-it-all. I'm also on a learning curve, particularly when you're a new director. So you want to be able to get more information and high quality information as much as possible. And one of the things that I have experienced on many occasions is that sometimes management filters information to their board. They may withhold certain material information or defer it for a different time. They may be aware that there are board members who are too vigilant, and perhaps this shouldn't come before the board at this particular time because Mr. X or Miss Y, they're going to ask certain questions. And even when the information is good and positive and optimistic, it may be packaged in a way that it doesn't really aid decision making. It actually just makes management looks good. So I start off with curiosity and scrutiny, and I look for the type of information that's coming forward. Is it supported? Can it be verified? How do they articulate it? To satisfy myself that what I'm getting is the whole picture and not just parts of the picture. And then as time goes on and you understand the nature of the landscape that you're dealing with in the particular entity or body, then you begin to pick up signs earlier, and instinct guides you towards asking particular questions and looking for more detailed reports or summaries on specific issues.
Yeah, I'd really like to simply underscore what Leslie Ann said, both now and in her previous intervention. The fact that we really do need board of directors who come to the table prepared, as in they really read their board packs and they do research, because Leslie Ann is correct. We really do need at this time to have directors on boards who are informed and very aware, and they are willing to go beyond the information that is simply handed to them in a board pack to do their research, and that's where I would really just underscore that it's critical, Louis.
I agree with Misha. In fact, I can give examples sometimes when I haven't been satisfied with a board paper or board summary, and they're asking you to make this urgent decision, because they're under pressure. Either, the initiator of the initiative is on a time-sensitive basis, or there's some political presence silent in the background that is driving it forward. And you feel that you just must make this decision right away, I would call the CEO, or I would call the CFO, and ask, can you give me some more information? Not that I'm mistrusting on the first presumption, but just to get more details to help me say, oh, okay, now I understand, but that wasn't in your paper, so and so, and then it enables me to feel more comfortable. in making the decision with speed or under some degree of pressure, because I get clarity of thought from the quality of information that's presented.
And you know, Leslie, and I'd also add that certainly on a board we have various expertise, and if you really you're not the subject matter expert on a particular thing, you within the board composite, you should have such the nature of a relationship with other board members that you offline before the board meeting, you know, have an engagement with the person who is a subject matter expert, so that because at the end of the day, you're going to be held liable for the decision that is made by the group. So if you want to be comfortable, you do your engagement and you seek your answers. We really do need people who are willing to be probing, to ask the tough questions, and to seek information in this day and age, you know. And I caution the reliance on AI. I know Claire Gomez would say the same. You know, AI helps augment, but it certainly isn't. We can't trust the reliability of it. We must do the research that is necessary.
Yeah, it's not foolproof. I agree, Misha. It's quite true.
Yeah, Louis, there's some comments in the chat you may want to look at.
Yeah, I saw Collins and welcome up, Kamala. We'd love to have you on the panel too if you wanna join us for the next few questions.
Thank you, Louis. This Colin, I think did you invite me? Yeah.
If you'd like to ask that.
Yeah. So from my experience, I think many organizations, and I don't know if it's a comfort zone, right? But I think they're very comfortable in the whole area of compliance and controls, right? I think the pace and intensity of risks, the type of risks that are emerging today is very different from what was emerging in the past, right? You just think about cyber. Cyber security has been around for 20, 25 years, but I think the cyber risks of today are very different to the cyber risk going forward will certainly accelerate in terms of intensity and in terms of all the other considerations, right? So it's a very significant, it's a very different type of risk, right? And it could bring down governments, it could bring down large organizations, it could bring down small organizations, right? And we've just seen what has happened in Venezuela with a hurricane. We've seen last year what happened in Jamaica with a hurricane and with an earthquake. Sorry, the one in Venezuela was an earthquake. So I think the whole area about you know how boards deal with this is, I think having these discussions are relevant, right? And it's very important that the boards are actually having this type of discussion, because I think there's a comfort zone around compliance and controls, right? And everybody has been drilled in that for the last 20, 30 years. And I think where people are not comfortable, and I don't think it's with malintent, but I think they're not comfortable looking at the emerging risk and really trying to make a conscious decision around what are the priorities, what will we actually do in terms of initiatives, actions, budget allocations in order to get behind this, and how to be able to manage this. And in the previous panel, one comment that I made, Louis, is that, Louis, sorry if I've pronounced it the wrong way, is that if you look at Jamaica, Jamaica's been a big success story. Hurricane Melissa hit them. It had a huge impact. And within 4 to 5 months, Moody's went in and their ratings actually went up. And that's because in preparation for hurricanes, they had a structured finance program that gave them access to $6.7 billion US, which is a big number for a Caribbean country. And that was in train, and basically it was rolled out expeditiously after the hurricane. Without that, it would have been a completely different disaster post-recovery, right? And they're not out of the woods as yet. But to be rated in February of 2026, for your ratings to improve after a hurricane in October 2025 of that size and scale, it shows you the resilience that comes from you know, how you manage during a crisis. And I suppose my summary is it's all around how you prepare for the crisis. Right?
Right.
And
So
you have to make choices along the way, because you can't cover every single potential risk. And that's where, sorry, Kamala, just to summarize, and that's where, in my view, the traditional controls are often the controls that the majority of the board and the majority of the leadership team are comfortable with. Comfortable from experience and knowledge, right? Okay. And therefore, something is happening out there. Something is changing rapidly. And in small fragmented countries with smaller companies, this is the dilemma that we're facing. How do we navigate this new world when the risks, the scale of the risks, the probability of an impact is increasing, and the scale of the impact is increasing, very, very significantly. So those are my comments in summary.
Thanks, Colin. And of course, we do welcome your contributions at any time. There's just been so very insightful. But I want us to make sure we acknowledge some of the contribution in the chat, because Dr. Dion Chamberlain, for instance, from Belize, she made a comment very early on that preparation before meetings is where many boards fail. They come in ready to prepare rather than be prepared. And I think a lot of what you shared here, Colin, just now, also speaks to that they're comfortable in the traditional space where they think it's okay, because when I come in now, using my experience, whatever information I get, I'll be able to prepare. But the pace of change is so fast. And especially if we're in a crisis.
Yeah.
In a crisis, you do what Misha and Lesley-Ann have said. You review the board pack. You call your fellow board members. You ask questions. You prepare yourself. So when you go into the boardroom, you are a lot more effective. I think that's a major challenge that need to be addressed for boards. And Dion also added just a short while ago, she said the fiduciary responsibility is important for board members to understand before making frivolous decisions.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of times, directors, and we did speak to this in the earlier panel as well, directors are not exposing themselves to continuous learning to prepare themselves for these types of scenarios, and especially understanding their fiduciary responsibility.
Very serious responsibility.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
I think Colin made some excellent points, and I'll tell you the one about Caracas. I mean, we know that we look at, climate challenges, etc. And with a hurricane, you can actually prepare. You have a few days warning in most instances. But look at the double earthquakes in Caracas. And what it triggered for me was, do we have an evacuation plan for our employees in a multi-story building in the event of an earthquake? Maybe that's a question I need to ask next, so that we have something in place. Because as Colin said, you can't prepare for every single risk, but there is a certain anticipatory awareness that you can inculcate in your board as these things arise. Do we have a plan or protocol or policy in place for an earthquake, for instance? That's part of the preparation.
Yes, absolutely. Because as was shared earlier, we may think an earthquake will not hit us, but then the fault lines run below the Earth's surface where we can't see. And so it can happen unexpectedly anyway. So those things, are we preparing for crisis? But I want to pick up on a point that both Lesley-Ann and Misha deferred on. And so I want us to explore that a little bit. Under what circumstances will the situation change? Because Misha made a very, very strong, compelling case about the responsibility of management to execute, and that the relationship between the board and management should be strong enough that even in a crisis, it is management that executes. But Lesley-Ann, you also shared that there are times of crisis when the board need to execute. And that in those circumstances, it is critical that the board be very aware, they understand all the issues and be ready to step in, but they don't stay there forever. So what are the circumstances that will cause a board to have to move into that arena? And we are talking crisis situations.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The first thing I would say is if you detect deficient or false information, if you have a situation with your senior management, whether it's your chief accountant or your CEO going rogue on you, and you have sufficient evidence that you need to take it above a notch and get into the operational side, then I don't think you have a choice. And for me, it's not so much about executing, but coming in at a deeper level, at a more microscopic level, because you're trying to diagnose the problem and prescribe the medication for how you treat it. And the only way to do that is by getting into the weeds, but you don't remain in the weeds. Hence the reason I say dynamic, engaged, operational, engaged. And you would prefer to be engaged because you have the confidence and trust in your management to deliver what you need to make the proper decisions, whether under pressure or not. But I do not believe blindly in this rigid boundary that we tend to put because this is the best type of corporate governance. Management and board are two separate things. The collapses that we have had in the Caribbean with insurance companies, with domestic banks, the offshore banking sector in Grenada that completely collapsed, the CLICO saga in Trinidad, that is the contemporaneous failure of management and board. No board oversight and weak operational symptoms on the part of management. That's the commonality amongst all of them. So let's not confine ourselves to this belief that the two shall remain separate throughout the life of any entity. No, there are times when one gives way to the other, depending on the circumstances. But we must know our limits, both board and management. And the other thing I would add to this is, sometimes management are very astute about their boards. While you're assessing management for their performance in line with your succession plan, management is assessing the board. Who are the troublemakers? Who is the scrutinizer? Who is the interrogator? Who is the silent keeper? Who is the minister's representative on the board silently? They are assessing you as we speak. It's mutual, it's reciprocal. So I have a passion in that area, as you can tell.
Certainly. And I will say, Leslie, and that you said made the defining point for me when you said, even if a board has to step in, it does not remain operational. And therefore you come back to my position, which is the two should remain for any organization to function effectively, distinct, but complementary. I said it earlier in my intervention that they are actually complementary responsibilities that to me must work harmoniously together, Leslie-Ann, in order for an organization to function effectively. But certainly we have seen it in our dynamic environment where a board has to step in. I remember about 2 years ago, speaking on one of your sessions, Kamla, where I was given an example about a board I actually sat on. I am no longer on that board, but he in Jamaica, he stepped in, sacked his senior management, a popular bank in Jamaica, well known, so everybody will know who I'm talking about, sacked his leadership and took over because his claim was that he was acting in the best interest of his shareholders who were not getting reaping the dividends or the benefit of their investment. He was the majority shareholder. He had a right to do what he did. But at the end of the day, I say, once the decisions are made, I will conclude and align with what Leslie-Ann said, that after that, a board does not remain operational. And that's what I conclude. Yeah.
Okay, so I see Claire has her hand up, but Claire, before we come to you, Yana Samuel has quite a lovely comment in the chat. I wanted to ask Yana if she can unmute and possibly share her thoughts with us. Yana, would you be able to unmute and share now, or would you prefer for us to read your comment out? I'm just looking quickly to see if she is unmuted. Or maybe, Claire, we could take your comment now and then come back to Yana.
Thanks, Kamla, because I found that question that you posed just now was so provocative. Yes, because you always say, the board and management must be separate and distinct. at all points in time, just to make sure that the boards don't get into that execution, and the execution arm must remain the execution arm. The board must remain oversight. But there are situations when it is a board must make a decision as to when it is going to go into that executing arm as part of that executing arm. But the process must ensure that you protect certain things on that board.
Yeah.
Right? So I would want to say in a situation like that, especially where you may have a loss of key personnel, although you may have had proper succession planning, your CEO dies, you realize that there's no one there to step into that role. Maybe a risk has materialized and those persons who are supposed to be on site are not there, etc. But the board need to understand that they must so appoint whichever selected director who will now step in. Appoint them as executive directors so that they are protected as an officer and not only as a director. So you want to make sure that they now become managing directors or executive directors as you may see fit. And they do understand their scope of authority and responsibilities, because now they're carrying not only their director's hat, but also in certain situations, their executioner's hat. You also have to make sure during that point of time that there are sufficient board members who remain independent so that they can form themselves as that court of appeal on that board. Yeah, you want to make sure that you select the persons, maybe the subject matter experts or whoever it is you may have to select to get in there, and then let that period of time be so stated. It's better that you say 3 months, 6 months, whatever it may be. And if you have to extend it, it comes back up to the board again for extension, right? That ensures the indemnity insurance, everything is in place to protect those individuals who are going beyond their role and responsibility as directors and going into that trench, that they are protected as officers also. Yeah, so that's the only thing that I would want to say, that there are controls that we need to put in place to make sure that we manage those new risks that will be coming up on the board for such an appointment. And also, the other thing that I also want to say too is that officers need to be trained in preparing for the boardroom.
Yeah.
They need to prepare board papers, board notes that are sufficient and suitable. Yes, to justify the decision or the request that they are making, whatever recommendation that they are making of the board. So there must be, that's the responsibility of management, not directors. Directors must try not to get involved in preparation of board papers, doing their own research so that they come to their own conclusion, that if it is wrong, there is nothing in that board paper that says what was management's conclusion to make that recommendation. So you want to protect yourself, please, right? If you're not satisfied with the sufficiency, and the quality of that board paper, let it go back. The chief executive officer is responsible for his team. And let him ensure so that when the board papers come up, that they are sufficient and suitable, and also to act as evidence as the due care and diligence that was placed by the board before they made that decision or accept that recommendation. Yes, but transfer that risk out of the boardroom back to management, please.
Yes. Now, I appreciate that the last contribution as well, Claire, in terms of training the officers. But I want to stay for a little longer with the point about when the board has to step into management. And I have 2 examples that I want to share. So we had in Trinidad and Tobago, First Citizens Bank, when the CEO left and the chairman took up the responsibility of CEO's role, and he became the executive chairman. And he was in that position for, I think, about 6 months. And this is Anthony Smart that I am talking about, who served as executive chairman. We did have Mr. Smart present to us at CCGI at one time, and it was an amazing story that he told, in terms of how that whole lived experience was. But he made the point that is being shared here as well, that it cannot be forever. You have to have a set time that you manage this.
Right.
My second example actually is CCGI. CCGI did go through its own crises, between 2018, 2019. There was a period of time when there was no CEO, there was no staff who could be appointed to carry on the operations of the institute. And therefore, the board formed a management team that held the institute together until they could appoint a new CEO. So, there are examples, and this is what we are talking about. In crisis,
yes,
you need to make different decisions. You have to take different steps, and you have to be ready to know how to do that and when to step back, when you have normalized situations. So Colin has his hand up now. So let's have Colin give his contribution, and then we'd read the contribution from Yana in the chat. Go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, I'll be very brief because I think we've discussed a lot of what I'm going to say, but I just want to create some distinctions here, right? So when we talk about independent board members stepping in to replace executives, right? This is a decision that's made in a crisis, in a sense. I call it a crisis, quote unquote. Somebody has departed. We can't find a replacement. We don't think that we have somebody. I don't know what happened at the bank, right? I'm just being hypothetical here, right? We don't believe we have somebody that can hold the reins and run the business for a period of time. And therefore, we take somebody that's an independent director on the board and we parachute them into the executive management team with a clear understanding that this will be temporary. So the first thing is, there are certain extreme circumstances that would give rise to this type of solution, but this should be rare and it should be really extreme. Otherwise, we will have absolute confusion in these boardrooms, right? Yeah. I think the second thing I want to talk about, and Misha kind of talked a little bit about it, is in the normal, in both private and public sector, we have seen many examples, and I'm not speaking about Misha's example. I want to be more generic, Misha, right? There are examples of very poor governance, okay, where there really is very poor governance, poor financial management, poor compliance. The fundamentals of the business, right? The DNA of the business is structurally wrong and flawed. And typically these businesses tend to crash at some point in time. They run over the precipice, they get into deep problems, right? And that is something that requires a different type of fix. Because in those types of situations, you may, if it runs into trouble, you may be required to, like, for example, in what happened in Trinidad, central bank intervened in a crisis not too long ago under Section 44D, and they took control, right? They basically said, when we take control, the voice of the shareholders, the voice of the board, the voice of the executives are gone. We are in control of this business now. So very poor governance can often lead to trouble. It can lead to financial reporting that's completely erroneous. It can lead to massive frauds. You could lead to massive mismatches. It could lead to risk tolerance levels that are just simply too high. You could get to undercapitalization, poor liquidity, and so forth, right? The third bucket that I see is organizations that are really trying to run their businesses properly, trying to deploy proper governance systems and so forth. And in this third bucket, I think that there's a different type of challenge. And that challenge is, how do we navigate this ongoing churn, if I could use that term, and that probably is not proper English, this ongoing challenge that's going on in terms of supply chain, in terms of all sorts of different risks now, geopolitical risks, cyber risk, and so forth. This requires a different dimension. And this is where I think the quality and the mindset of the independent chairman and the composition of the independent directors and their interface with the executives and their decision, because the board has to, in a simple sense, the role of a board is to hire and fire the CEO. In the simplest sense, right? Get the right person to run the business, right? And I think in that third bucket, that is the key to success, right? Because if you have the right complement in there, you will think about the risks of today. You will think about the risks emerging in the future. You will think about the strategy of the business. You will not be infallible. You will make errors along the way, but you'd be smart enough and you would have enough integrity to be able to deal with it and fix it. So that's kind of like my 3 buckets. This is not a technical dissertation, right? This is just how I think about it sometimes, right? And that's what I just wanted to say, Kamla, to the team here today.
So, and I like those very much, Colin, and especially your first point, which is that crisis should be rare. So the idea of the board having to step in must be the exception to the rule. The rule
and something that has to be thought out very carefully. This has to be almost a last resort. Because if you deploy this could become like musical chairs, right? Okay, so this will create all sorts of distortions, right? You know, this creates problems around, is the board in operations? Was the board in really focusing on strategy, succession, and so on? Where's the board, right? You understand? As opposed to where's the executive leadership team? That has to be very carefully thought out.
I want to just comment on what Colin mentioned here, Kamla, and I think it's an important point about reinforcing that it is a last resort option to have the board jumping into the executive CEO seat, etc. But I'll tell you what it triggers for me is the lack of proper attention that we give to succession planning. Because you will have succession planning papers presented to you over time, and there is a line of succession, who is next in line, etc. If you are preparing for a crisis, let us say your CEO is out due to illness for a long period of time, who is coming in next? And if in that line of succession, your 1, 2, and 3 are not capable of competently sitting in that seat, even on a temporary basis, then it says to me we need to reassess how we deal with succession planning. And I think it is a critical exercise of any board, whether it is public sector, private sector, or nonprofit, to understand the risk and the implications for bad succession planning or no succession planning or inadequate succession planning. And so to Colin's point, if the succession plan was well prepared and executed and analyzed, you wouldn't need your board or your board chairman to step into the seat of the CEO for his temporary absence or perhaps a permanent exit. There will be someone next in line to take that place. So it's food for thought for us to consider as well.
And all I'll say to that, Kamla, is ditto, ditto, ditto.
But Murphy law is as such.
That's right.
One day you'll wake up and you realize not one of the others that you have lined up to follow that seat wants the seat. You see? Yeah. So sometimes it's like that. Sometimes you fail to realize that like everybody's around the same age. Sometimes the crisis is forcing them into early retirement. So like, for instance, what happened with the pandemic, you see, sometimes it's only like, for instance, I always say when it is you're looking at safety issues, right? So you can train all of your fire wardens, but when that fire starts, that is the only time that you see whether a fire warden is going to be doing exactly what he has been trained to do, or whether he's going to abandon the company and deal with his own family. So you don't know, or he just faints and you now need to take a lot of your time to fix him. You know, so you have to, under astute risk management, even plan for when your succession plan itself fails. You know, so yes, you may not want to have any of your directors be forced to take up executive duties, but sometimes it really happens. And especially with formation boards, when it is that you're now establishing an organization and then you find that, yes, it's a board of management. You now need to get that organization up and running, only to find the first person you're supposed to hire is your chief executive officer. And only to find that's like the last person that you can really get full approval to put that person in place. So then the board has to determine, okay, how are we going to manage these executive duties that have befallen us? So all those sort of things, you do have the situations when it occurs, but as Colin, as Leslie, as all of us have agreed, it's supposed to be rare. It's supposed to be fully justified. It's a last recourse. It is not on a daily basis. And even now you find the separation of executive management from the chairman of financial institution. is being enforced by the regulator. So hence my having to step down as the executive chairman and take a managing directorship. Otherwise, I would have still been executive chairman. So what you're seeing here is that level of trying to get the directors to be independent directors, and if you don't at least have independent directors over your internal over the board audit, governance, and risk committees. So you do want to make sure that you have independence there.
Yes, because you don't want to lose the oversight function, which is what the board provides, right? So, Luis, I just want to quickly look at the chat. We have Yana Samuels. She said, timely and transparent reporting that is pressure tested, particularly through scenario-based inquiry, which we dealt with in the previous panel, in board meetings is critical. While there's a distinction between board and management roles, often in crisis, there can be a blurring of lines between critical decisions that are operational and sit primarily with management to execute, and those which should sit with or first be approved by a board or brought to shareholders based on the nature of the decision. Boards should not abandon fiduciary and legal obligations during a crisis. Additionally, disaster risk management is a subset of a business continuity plan, and they are sometimes looked at very differently. Yana is joining us from Jamaica, and she too brings a tremendous amount of experience in serving both at capacities of management and board. I also want to share quickly, there is a contribution from Rowan Braffett-Basad. She says, in helping to ensure that we can effectively deal with crisis if and when they occur, management in SMEs and large organizations must ensure that we consider the risks relating to the economy, the climate, technology, society, and geopolitics, and also ensure that there are plans in place that are reviewed and tested regularly. The essential, to me, the absolute essential is that the plan should have copies of the latest version. So I guess that's version planning is also an important thing. So you don't execute on the wrong version, right? So for some businesses, management alone will be involved, and in other, both management and the board will be involved. In that scenario, it will be essential for the board, or at least the particular board members, to be involved in the testing. So, and we do have a couple other contributions from Mohini about, the fact that the private sector plans are sometimes based on who knows who, and maybe not necessarily who can quickly take over the role. And in the public sector, there's hardly succession planning. And then Christed added the value of scenario planning and having an active business continuity plan approach, is so important. Now, this particular panel is looking at crisis situations. And therefore, this is why it's been really important for us to delve into how you make those decisions, because you are talking about real time in the midst of the crisis. And sometimes all your best planning does not prepare you for what can happen. And we have seen, for instance, things that has happened in the world totally outside of our control, but the impact comes directly on us. We have had, for one thing, we have all, as Misha used, the lived experience of COVID-19, where there were so many unprecedented things that we had to find solutions for. Then we had the blockage of the Panama Canal for several days that led to supply chain issues all around. We've had the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. Now we've had the impact of the US entering Venezuela. Now, poor Venezuela is now also dealing with this earthquake on top of that geopolitical issue. The pressures on the Hormuz Strait with that war between the US and Iran, and the impact that is happening around the world. Therefore, we can't sit and plan, but the crises will come. And when they come, directors, are we prepared? Do we understand what are the actions that are the most appropriate to take in that situation? That's what we need to be asking ourselves continuously.
Agreed.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot there. I'm just curious, how do you make sure that everyone's actually acting from the same source of information or truth? Like, obviously, in a crisis, things are flying around, different people are seeing or sending different things. You're maybe picking up the phone and talking to the executives or the stakeholders. How do you actually keep track of that and get things in writing and make sure that, it's actually all the same set of facts that people are dealing with to make a decision?
So I leave that to Leslie and Misha to deal with, but I want to just tell everyone that the survey link is in the chat. Thank you very much, Monique. We do want your feedback, please. I'm asking everyone who is on the participating today, please give us your feedback, because I want to share what I'm sure would be some very positive responses with our panelists. They've been really, really brilliant. So Lezian, I think Lewis asked a really great question there, and you and Misha are quite capable of giving an answer. How do you ensure that everyone is reading from the same page and going to go in the same direction?
I'm going to defer to Misha first.
Oh, wow. I was about to say you. I still say that I think boards should still have independent thinking. We should have boards and persons on the board who are willing to even have dissenting views and perspective. At the end of the day, we then have to rely on a good chairman to balance the perspectives and bring us to the point where decisions are being made at the end of the day in the best interest of the organization and its stakeholders. That's my very simple answer. I don't always feel that we should have groupthink on any board. It doesn't augur well for a board at all to function that way. But at the end of the day, in a crisis, I think that it really becomes a tough one where the board and the chairman of the board during that time of crisis, when certainly decisions need to be made rapidly, that you have to look at the information, whether the information is complete or whether it is incomplete. And then I think it was clear in the session before, or someone on that panel spoke about partnership and collaborative decision-making, at the end of the day, is what I think has to obtain.
I want to wholeheartedly endorse what Misha is saying about leadership, because I think this is when leadership really comes to the fore. Because what you have is a dashboard of activity taking place all at once. You're in crisis mode. You're dependent on your management more than ever to give you the data, to bring you the report, the summary, whatever it is, to enable you to make that decision. And for me, why the leadership becomes the core of the center right now is because the essence of leadership is what you build before that storm, before that crisis. Right. Not just what you do in the crisis, but you have created the landscape before that your directors can embrace it when it comes. So you're almost acting like a war room collaboratively between management and board of directors to dissect the problem, to find the solution, to explore the options, and then make a final decision. It really does call that question for leadership to come to the fore, supported by the directors. And that group thinking pattern that Misha talked about, this is just a disaster for boards. You don't want that chorus perspective. You want someone who is able to dissent. You want someone who can disagree respectfully, with credibility, information, data-driven, but you can't always we can't be sheep, because if we are sheep, we can't handle a crisis. And if we can't handle a crisis, we can't make a decision under pressure. And so the substance of each director collaboratively is what really makes boards govern well in crisis and complexity.
Indeed. I love that. So it's really a lot about your board culture. It is encouraging the independent thought, but having the very frank discussions. So, Louis, when it's time that there's a crisis, you can trust that the communication is open, it's honest. The board is accustomed to having the various points of view and the respect to be able to agree, even if they disagree on certain points, agree on the direction, and then support that direction. I think that really is the board culture that you want to develop that will sustain you in a crisis.
And it's a lot harder to do in public boards. A lot harder to do in public boards because you have that silent political presence in the background, because you might have appointees on that board who are serving that political interest above the interest of the organization. There is a conflict. And so you have to be really careful and comfortable in your own skin to make these independent decisions that goes against the political grain. But there are ways to overcome that. I never believe in surprising my chairman. I don't believe in, completely ignoring the political directive. So how do I engage the minister or the permanent secretary in a manner that I can say there is potential opposition to this? Is there another way we can find to arrive at a decision that is more balanced or fair or transparent or whatever it might be? So there are always options to explore rather than take the cowardly position, follow like sheep and remain silent.
Yes, thank you, Leslie. There's a comment from Claire in the chat. She says you must have a crisis communication plan long before the crisis. It says, who is the authorized speaker for the organization? How and what information must be gathered? Who gets the information? Who verifies it, etc. So, there's a plan just in case, always just in case now.
Yeah.
Because you never know what's around the corner.
Yeah. Because if you go back to what happened with TSTT recently there when they had a cyber attack, on their database, that was poor communication during that crisis. Because the first thing that they needed to do was to determine their stakeholders and what communication was supposed to be sent to them. Yes. And to not leave it for that information to be leaked in the public domain, because you had a lot of negative impact on everybody's reputation thereafter, even with threats of being replaced, dismissed, etc. So you do want to make sure that, again, go back into the inherent risk within your organization. What are the type of risk where it is that chaos can reign? Yeah. And as we said before, who are the person, who's the risk owner? Because each risk ought to have a risk owner. So we have single point accountability. So between those two, and then it escalates. So then you know exactly when that risk materializes or is going to materialize, what happens, how that communication should take place. Who are the first persons to get that communication? Because you don't want the minister to hear about it and the board doesn't even know about it. The board must know even before the public get to know.
There we go.
Yes. And then the political ones have to get it because they will do their thing and they will add their own information, even though it is from their own imagination. So you definitely want to make sure that the facts are there and then exactly how you will make the statement. At this point in time, we are investigating the root cause of this failure. We are going to get back to you. At this point in time, we are asking our customers to please bear with us, and you select the right person with the right tone to deliver the message and build that public trust and confidence. So you want to make sure that you go through the scenario before, but you have to prepare it. It cannot wait until the crisis occurs because everybody wants to speak on behalf of the company. So you want to make sure that you manage that, even the social media release. You make sure that you also scan and monitor anybody who is sending out false information during that period of time, because you'll be amazed how something happens and you're going to see all of these false information coming with your logo, with your name, etc. So you want to make sure that you monitor all of that type of communication and you respond as quickly as possible. So communication is very, very critical for within the organization at that point in time and for all stakeholders, and a lot of time, including the public. Yes, so we want to make sure that we're on top of that crisis communication plan.
Is that
Excellent
clear?
question, Louis.
Excellent contribution there. I think we underestimate the value of corporate communications during crisis and how quickly we need to deploy that and why that should have been identified before any crisis. So
True.
you know that Miss X is the one or Mr. T is the one that we're going to in the event of something, and cut it early so that the damage doesn't escalate.
Yeah.
Because of the social media and the internet, it is amazing how much reputational damage you can incur within hours of some adverse event. So we can't underestimate that. And that again is preparedness.
Yeah. And as I said earlier in my own intervention, Leslie, it is about also being transparent and honest. You know, I think if people underestimate you being honest, even in saying that you don't have the answers yet.
Yes.
You know, it is not about doing the cosmetic. It's just about being open and transparent, because that's what give your stakeholders confidence, you know. So we can't underestimate it. And again, thank you, Claire, for that point. Well made.
Yeah.
So, Louis, you have just less than 5 minutes remaining on this panel.
Yeah.
You may want to
I just
ask.
had one final question for our two panelists and anyone else that if there's time. But I'm just curious, looking back, is there a decision that you've made under pressure that you would have made differently now? And not necessarily because it was wrong, but just because you've learned something that has changed your thinking.
I wouldn't necessarily, you know, regret decisions. I never look at regrets, but what I'd say, if I would say it differently, is exactly what we've just been talking about, communication. Communicate more frequently. And I say it again, even when we don't have the answers. Because certainly during a crisis and uncertainty, communication itself becomes what I would call leadership. It is what drives keep our stakeholders not just informed, but even a sense of comfort or confidence. You know, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, a testing question there, Louis. Because there are times when you think I've made a certain decision and really looking back on it, I probably should not have made it then. But you know, hindsight is 20/20 vision, right?
Yes.
When you're faced with a multiplicity of facts in a high-pressured situation, sometimes you look to the first or second option without exploring other options that would probably enable a better decision. So it happens. You can't always avoid it. But the most important thing is if it's a mistake that you learn from it, so you don't repeat it on the next occasion. I think that is the lesson that I would draw from that.
Wow, very, very diplomatic answers and excellent, you know, obviously great faith in your own decisions and again, you know, that's why you're here, right? And Kamala, I'm curious, what would you leave all the new directors that are just starting out, like what's the main thing beyond the communication point that these two have made that really is going to build success in a crisis?
I think the most important thing that was shared earlier, and it started with Misha identifying it as well, and that's the issue of building trust. That is more key, I think, even than your communication plan. So directors need to understand as they step into the boardroom, they have a shared responsibility, but they have an individual duty to ensure they prepare themselves to serve well with their fellow directors. That is the first mindset I think it's important to our directors to have. And then, of course, the continuous learning, because our environment is changing so dramatically all the time. You know, we must always want to give of our best. That's just my thinking on things. And yes, we make mistakes, but for me, I think mistakes are sometimes a necessary part of our journey.
Correct.
Sorry, Kamala. You know, I would, because Louis asked a question about a first-time board of director, here's what I'd also say. The reality of the world we're now living in is that we won't be able to just prepare for risks that we can foresee or can imagine or think about. The reality is that we're gonna have to, sitting on boards, begin to be prepared as and I love the term that Leslie-Ann in her introductory commentary spoke about, which is the preparedness governance. We're gonna have to even be preparing boards and having the kind of systems in place and structures to prepare for the risk that we cannot see, because the reality is this is the world in which we're living in, you know, where we cannot predict risk. And not only that, the presentation, Kamala, that I'd made at the CCCU convention recently is looking at the fact that, you know, we can't see risk in silos anymore. Risks are now so interdependent, right? And this is, so boards now are gonna have to begin to even change the board of directors, how they look at risk. It is so interdependent. You know, when we talk about a hurricane and the impact of a hurricane, it's not just a climate issue. For example, a hurricane is going to impact your company's liquidity, its operations, its business continuity. And let us not talk about digital and cyber security risk as well. Right?
That's right.
So
Yes,
I'm just saying that we have to begin as boards to think through a grid that risk and the volatile environment in which we operate, it is so interconnected. And that is why decisions have to be, we have to have informed boards, as repeating what Leslie-Ann said. Informed boards are directors that are so much aware, and that they're also building institutions that can survive and thrive in the world of complexity in which we now operate.
Thanks, Misha. We are 2 minutes over time, but I want to ask Leslie-Ann if she still wants to give a wrap-up comment. Misha, I'm going to take that from you as your closing comments. Leslie-Ann, anything you want to share quickly?
Yes, I know you're over time. I would say a couple of things. Governance, not just attendance. Preparation, not just reaction. And information.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Louis, I want to thank you very much. It's always a pleasure having you being part of Governance Week. I know we stretched you today because usually your space is technology and having to deal with cybersecurity and AI, but today the ladies who are dealing with crisis, you know, and I think it all came across really well. I want to thank Vashti in her absence, our very new Dr. Vashti Guyadeen, CEO of the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce, for her contribution earlier. Thank you very much, Misha. Misha has been a member with us for quite a while. I know she's very proud of her membership here with us at CCGI. And we are happy to have you too, Misha. Leslie-Ann, I want to tell you, you are an absolute great find. I'm glad the Republic Bank suggested you to me, because you really have a lot to share as well. So you know we are going to be reaching out to you more in the future, because your voice needs to be amplified a lot more. There's a tremendous amount of experience there that we want to add. So thank you all very much as we end this panel 2 now. We go on a short break and then we come back for our final panel for today. And that panel very aptly looks at board culture, which is one of the things that was introduced in this discussion. We will be looking at culture, ethics, and accountability, the invisible forces that is shaping organizational resilience. Our moderator is Sarona Rupchan, and our panelists will be Delia Joseph, Simone Pearson, and Glenn Harrison from Barbados. So I'm not sure why I was hearing some noises in the background, but at any rate, thank you all so much. Quantrell, let's bring this panel to a close now with our tribute to our sponsors. Then we will go on our short break.
Thank you, Kamala.
Right. Thank you. Just a reminder, please make sure and give us your feedback